Coming up this season on DNA ID, a couple shot at a campground, a realtor waylaid at a home showing, a bookstore owner stabbed among her volumes, a young soldier dumped in a parking lot. What do all these tragic cases have in common? They are all cold cases solved after decades of frustration and futility by forensic genealogy. I'm Jess Betancourt, and in Season 2 of DNA ID, I'll bring you 24 more fascinating cases in which the killer eluded generations of investigators until science and some crafty genealogists cracked them at long last. Listen to DNA ID on your favorite podcast platform. New episodes drop every other Monday, starting January 10th, 2022.
You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, 3 Men and a Mystery, and All Things Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
The long search for the Zodiac killer goes on, and with every passing year, it diminishes the possibility of any meaningful justice in this case, other than identifying the man responsible for 5 murders in Northern California in the late 1960s. One promising technique of identifying the Zodiac is to go backwards rather than forwards, and search the Bay Area newspapers for letters to the editors. This approach is nothing new, but by seeking out the Zodiac killer before he became the Bay Area murderer, we have the distinct possibility he interacted with the editors of the respective newspapers and left wording and phraseology that mimicked his soon-to-be Zodiac letters that began on July 31st, 1969. But more importantly, is it possible that Zodiac used his real name in his pre-Zodiac correspondence? But there still remains the possibility that the Zodiac inadvertently gave us clues to his identity and origins within the communications and phone calls subsequent to July 31st, 1969. Just in the way some Zodiac researchers have been searching for an individual who was present in both Riverside and the Bay Area during the relevant time periods, this approach shouldn't be limited to just Riverside, but perhaps expanded to cover the rest of the United States. The Zodiac operated in Northern California, but his origins may lie further afield, and by identifying his birthplace or the location where he spent his formative years, it may give us a name common to both areas. After the attack at Lake Berryessa on September 27, 1969, Brian Hartnell was interviewed by Sergeant John Robertson at the Queen of the Valley Hospital, who collectively arrived at the understanding that the Zodiac stated he was an escaped convict from Montana, possibly Deer Lodge. The police report actually throws into doubt the validity of the Montana connection because it details the testimony of Sergeant William White, who stated that Brian Hartnell related to him that the subject advised him he was an ex-con out of Colorado. The state of Colorado shares a border with Oklahoma, near the city of Boise in Cimarron County. Oklahoma would become important to the Zodiac case just 10 weeks later, when on December 7, 1969, somebody rang the commercial radio station KTOK in Oklahoma City, claiming to be the infamous Zodiac. This phone call was treated with skepticism by law enforcement, who didn't give this phone call the proper attention it warranted. In doing so, police may have missed another vital lead in the Zodiac killer case.
In his conversation with Brian Hartnell, Sergeant John Robertson discussed the killer's voice, probing for additional information, stating, "Brian, you mentioned a drawl. Well, not a drawl, an accent. This obviously opens up the possibility that the Zodiac killer was originally from out of state. On December the 7th, 1969, somebody rang the Oklahoma City radio station and spoke to the host, remarking that, 'I don't need to kill. There are too many people killed on the highways and that's legal. But added that he was prepared to kill, highlighting that there's plenty of parking lots in Oklahoma and mentioning one large Oklahoma shopping center by name. Larry Lamotte, news director of the KTOK radio station, remarked, "I don't see how it can be anything but a hoax. The caller was too familiar with Oklahoma City. He knew the name of our shopping centres and mentioned our high rate of traffic fatalities, and even the governor's Live for the 70s programme. If Larry Lamotte thought the phone caller was too familiar with Oklahoma, then maybe he was, possibly regularly visiting the state and or having family or friends living there. There remains a chance that the phone caller once had roots in the south central state. Many Zodiac researchers have suggested that the phraseology of fiddle and fart that Zodiac used in his Los Angeles letter on March the 13th, 1971, may have originated in the 1950s in such states as Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota. Larry Lamotte stated that the phone caller did an awfully good impression of the man who rang the Jim Dunbar show on October the 22nd, 1969. The date of this call, December the 7th, 1969, was the same date a letter from the Zodiac Killer was mailed from Fairfield, California, to the San Francisco Chronicle, also imitating the man who rang the Jim Dunbar show. 2 contacts on the same day, one by letter, one by phone, both imitating the Jim Dunbar show caller. The letter stated, "I just need help. I will kill again, so expect it any time now. There will be a cop. Then I will turn myself in. Okay?" The October the 22nd, 1969 caller to the Jim Dunbar show pleaded for help, but more crucially, it was reported in a published article on August 1971 that the caller to the Oakland Police Department a few hours before the Jim Dunbar show aired told the operator that he wanted to give himself up, but only if he could be represented by a famous lawyer. The December the 7th letter author also claimed, quote, "I will turn myself in." Additionally, the statement of "I just need help" and "there will be a cop" in the December the 7th letter, not released to the public, was copied by the next 2 Zodiac letters. The Melvin Belli letter on December the 20th thrice pleaded, "Please help me," and the April the 20th, 1970 letter claimed, "There is more glory in killing a cop." If you were ever in any doubt that the December the 7th, 1969 Fairfield letter was genuine, then look no further than its 38-character code, mimicking the recently solved 340 cipher, where the author of the Z38 code uses the first 4 characters and last 5 characters from the Z340, which produced 2 English words before the period 19 shift was applied to the solution. We effectively have a letter and phone call on December the 7th, 1969, which both imitated the caller to the Jim Dunbar show, and the December the 7th, 1969 letter was genuine Zodiac correspondence. If the letter is a genuine Zodiac communication, what is the likelihood of the phone call being a completely separate individual when both occurred within hours of one another?
The only 3 people widely reported to have heard the Zodiac's voice were Nancy Slover, Brian Hartnell, and David Slate. They replayed a recording of the voice on the Jim Dunbar show and unanimously agreed it was not the voice of the Zodiac Killer. The KTOK radio station in Oklahoma made a recording of the conversation between the man claiming to be the Zodiac and the host of the radio station, which they made available to law enforcement to listen to. According to station employee Larry Lamotte, they didn't even come to collect recordings of the man's voice when offered the tapes. If law enforcement believed that the caller wasn't the Zodiac, then they apparently came to that conclusion without ever listening to the tapes. At a bare minimum, all they had to do was play the tapes to Nancy Slover, Brian Hartnell, and David Slate, and get their opinion on the caller's voice, while their memories were still fresh. Whether those tapes still exist today is a very important question, because the entire transcript of the conversation may reveal extra information and vital clues as to the authenticity of the caller, using all the knowledge that we have gained in the intervening 51 years. If Larry Lamont thought the caller was too knowledgeable about Oklahoma, did he also believe that the caller had an Oklahoma accent? Possibly the accent described by Brian Hartnell to Sergeant John Robertson while recovering in his hospital bed at the Queen of the Valley Hospital. We also have possible avenues of exploration in Atlanta and New York. On October 13, 1969, the Zodiac, for the only time in his authenticated letter-writing campaign, placed the Zodiac crosshairs on the return address side of the envelope. This envelope had never been released publicly at the time somebody mailed the August 1, 1973 Albany, New York letter and March 8, 1981 Atlanta letter. Both the Albany and Atlanta letters contained very small Zodiac crosshairs on the return address spot of the envelope, exactly mimicking the envelope mailed 2 days after the Paul Stein murder. The Atlanta letter mailed on March 8, 1981, also mimicked the Paul Stein letter, mentioning San Francisco and reinstating his intention to kill children, because they are easy to pick off. Was the use of crosshairs on the envelope primarily chosen because he wanted these distant regions of America to recognize the importance of the letters, by including the symbol synonymous with his activities in Northern California? The Zodiac may also have interjected himself into the case of Joan Webster, a 25-year-old Harvard grad who disappeared after her arrival at Boston's Logan International Airport on November 28, 1981. Her remains were eventually discovered 9 years later in April 1990 in Hamilton, Massachusetts. Her disappearance happened in the same year the Atlanta letter was mailed. In January 1982, a Christmas card was mailed to Joan Webster's family, eerily reminiscent of the cryptic Christmas card mailed to the sister of Donna Lass in December of 1974. The Zodiac likely had no involvement in the disappearance and murder of Joan Webster, but just like his letter-writing campaign in Northern California, he wasn't shy in attaching himself to murder cases in which he had no involvement in.
The Atlanta letter, referencing San Francisco and picking of children, was mailed only 6 days after another suspected Zodiac letter, when on March 2, 1981, a business reply envelope postmarked Cleveland, Ohio, bearing the press-printed address, the Danbury Mint, Richards Avenue, P.O. Box 5260, Norwalk, Connecticut, was mailed with a handwritten note, "Please stop forced busing or I will kill 3 more black boys in Atlanta in March." Both the March the 2nd and March the 8th communications were attempting to piggyback off the attention created by the Atlanta child murders, something we know the Zodiac Killer liked to do in the Bay Area and beyond. On March the 18th, 1981, the Washington Post newspaper received a letter addressed to the editor of the Washington Post, claiming to have information on the Atlanta killings and requesting that the editor place an advertisement in the newspaper stating, "Daniel, please call home." This letter, although seemingly innocuous, did not even get the missing Atlanta child's name correct. Darren Glass, aged 10, was last seen at approximately 4 p.m. on September the 14th, 1980, having left his house at 2289 Memorial Drive, southeast Atlanta, Georgia, where he lived with his foster mother, Fannie Mae Smith. Darren Glass is the only child listed in the victims of Wayne Williams whose remains have never been found, so is effectively still missing. On November the 29th, 1980, the Indianapolis Star newspaper stated, quote, "Darren Glass, one of 4 missing black children who have been the subject of widespread searches here, may have tried to contact his foster family recently," police said Friday. "We are investigating someone calling the foster parents and hanging up," said Atlanta Public Safety Commissioner Lee Brown. The article was entitled, "Child May Have Tried to Call Home." The anonymous letter on March the 18th, 1981, possibly from the Zodiac Killer, seemingly played on the words in these headlines, stating, "Daniel, please call home," instead of "Darren, please call home. 3 sinister letters mailed in just 17 days. So had the Zodiac killer temporarily relocated to Atlanta, Georgia, in the southeastern region of the United States? There is, however, something else that ties into the Atlanta story. The March 2nd, 1981 Stop Forced Busing letter used a business reply envelope postmarked Cleveland, Ohio, but bore the press-printed address, the Danbury Mint, Richards Avenue, P.O. Box 5260, Norwalk, Connecticut. The Danbury Mint ran advertisements in 18 newspapers through a mail-order company advertising miniature pewter models of classic automobiles. The Danbury Mint is a division of MBI Incorporated that markets a variety of collectibles. These pre-printed envelopes were inserted inside each newspaper, one of which was the Staten Island Advance in New York, which could very well be where the author of the forced busing letter sourced the envelope. Danbury Mint in Norwalk is approximately 40 miles from New York. The March 18th, 1981 letter was mailed to the Washington Post, which sits 200 miles from New York. A 4th sinister letter in the series arrived, this time postmarked Williamsport, Pennsylvania, on April 23rd, 1981, bearing a pre-printed address and was mailed with the accompanying handwritten note beginning, quote, "You shall die, I'm going to." The postage-paid envelope in this instance was used by a company to distribute literature to its prospective customers. The distribution was made from the New York office of the company. These sinister communications lead us nicely into the next chapter of the story.
On or about January 20th, 1982, a Santa Claus card was mailed to the Glenridge family home of missing 25-year-old Harvard grad Joan Webster, with the pre-printed address of 654 Grandview Avenue, Ridgewood, New York. It was mailed inside a business reply envelope for the Better Life Journal, with the press-printed address of 7617D, Metro Drive, Austin, Texas. Glenridge is 12 miles from downtown New York. The Santa Claus card carried the message, "Please, where can I write you?" Not many serial killers wrote letters to newspapers and to victims' families, but even fewer mixed niceties in with their threats. For example, the Zodiac wrote, "Please, no nasty ones like Melvin's," in the Dragon card on April 28, 1970, and "Please help me" 3 times in the Melvin Belli letter on December 20th, 1969. The March 2nd, 1981 letter stated, "Please stop forced busing." The March 18th, 1981 letter stated, "Daniel, please call home." And the Santa Claus card read, "Please, where can I write you?" Signed with the initials SC. 3 short, sinister communications bearing the introduction of "please," mailed inside of 1 year, and all can be connected to areas within 200 miles of New York or in New York itself. On August 1st, 1973, a letter postmarked Albany, claiming to be from the Zodiac, was mailed to the Albany Times-Union in New York. The writer threatened that he was going to start killing again at the Albany Medical Center. Just like the please communications, this letter would again contain the niceties of Albany is a nice town. This letter would also contain the small crosshairs on the address side of the envelope, exactly like the Atlanta letter mailed on March 8, 1981. Was the Zodiac somehow connected to New York through family, friends, his formative years, or his employment? Or did he have some kind of connection to Atlanta or Oklahoma, or all 3? There's no evidence whatsoever that the Zodiac murdered anyone in Atlanta or Albany, or had any involvement in the disappearance and murder of Joan Webster. But we do know he interjected himself into the disappearance of Donna Lass from South Lake Tahoe on September 6, 1970, and quite possibly may have written a Christmas card to her sister on December 27, 1974. So it wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility that he mailed a Santa Claus Christmas card to the family of missing Joan Webster just over 7 years later, especially when you consider the Atlanta letter was signed Zodiac and was mailed the same year that Joan Webster went missing.
If we focus on 3 communications related to issues beyond California, in State Line, Nevada, in Albany, New York, and in Atlanta, Georgia, it can be noted that the Pines card, Albany letter, and Atlanta letter all contained a version of the Zodiac crosshairs on the address side of the communication, with the crosshairs positioned around the punch hole on the Pines card and the other two on the envelope in Albany and Atlanta. We also have a possible Zodiac connection to 3 disappearances in 3 states. The Zodiac killer cryptically claimed involvement in the Donna Lass disappearance on March the 22nd, 1971, possibly wrote the Darren Glass communication in Atlanta on March the 18th, 1981, and it isn't beyond the realms of possibility he mailed the New York Christmas card to the family of Joan Webster in January 1982, as he had done to the family of Donna Lass some 7 years earlier. Both Christmas cards were brief and cryptic in nature, and both concerned 2 25-year-old missing women whose families had offered rewards for information about their disappearances. If we are going to look back at letters to the editor in the time period before the Zodiac began his assault on the people of Northern California, examining the phraseology in print, we must also consider the possibility that the Zodiac killer travelled further afield to Albany, Atlanta, contacting the newspapers in and out of the Zodiac persona before and after the Zodiac murders began. Did he select the town of Albany because he had some personal attachment to this location through birth, family or friends? One would like to think that the Albany Medical Center was just plucked out of a hat for no reason whatsoever. We have somebody claiming to be the Zodiac killer who rang an Oklahoma radio station in 1969, but we also have an unknown male Caucasian who telephoned the Conyers Sheriff's Office in Atlanta at 7:30 p.m. on January the 8th, 1981, and at 11:45 a.m. on January the 15th, 1981, claiming responsibility for the recent Atlanta killings and giving directions to his latest victim. A search of the area failed to uncover any murder victims, resulting in a second telephone call to police by the white male, indicating they had searched the wrong area. The calls had been placed from a local convenience store. The caller made further threats to kill a white child from one of the subdivisions off Sigmund Road in Conyers and gave a deadline of February the 1st, 1981. In between the 2 telephone calls, a search was conducted on January the 10th, 1981, close to Red Wine Road and the I-285 in southwest Atlanta, uncovering the skeletal remains of 2 young children. Evidentiary value or certain clues were discovered at that location, which included the Best of Penthouse Letters No. 1, a pornographic collector's edition, 2 pieces of white cloth with a blue stripe, and magnetic recording tape. The Atlanta murders are extremely unlikely to have any connection to the Zodiac killer. However, that doesn't mean he can be definitively ruled out in being the responsible for some or all of the letters and telephone calls to police. We know his propensity to claim crimes he wasn't a participant in, along with his willingness to write communications and direct police to the scene of his crimes. But the most important feature regarding the 2 telephone calls to the Conyers Sheriff's Office on January the 8th and January the 15th, 1981, is that they were both recorded, just like the Oklahoma call in 1969. Searching for the Zodiac killer's voice on tape would be the holy grail of discoveries, and even if these recordings may draw skepticism from many Zodiac researchers, confident they are not the Bay Area murderer, ignoring the possibility achieves nothing.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Right, one of Mike Rodelli's first ports of call was scouring the newspapers to see if his suspect wrote to the editors prior to the Zodiac crimes and communications. Have you unearthed anything interesting, Mike, with regards to your suspect or any others in the Bay Area newspapers, and have you searched wider afield to discover the origins of the Zodiac killer?
So I like Mike Rodelli's idea. It was something that I always thought for a long time could be valid, that Zodiac was a frequent writer to newspapers and to the editors, and maybe had, before the Zodiac murders especially, I don't know that anybody used his name once he started, but I started thinking that before that, we might see patterns of names going to newspapers from people that wrote frequently, and one of those might have some verbiage or some words or some phrases that Zodiac was fond of, and that might be a clue. So I applaud Mike Rodelli's efforts and to scour newspapers, but the issue with that is when he found something, it was interesting to him, and he latched onto that person. I wasn't looking for anyone in particular's name. I just was looking more for words or phrases or things that we know Zodiac would later use. Now, putting the cart before the horse, I guess, now that I have a suspect, I've gone back and looked through a lot of newspapers in the Bay Area, especially Vallejo, different areas that I know the suspect operated, and I have not found any newspaper articles that have letters published from him that I can find. I think it's still worthwhile to do that, to go looking through these newspapers. I have a lot of them on my website, a lot of letters to the editors, and from the Vallejo Times-Herald, from the San Francisco Chronicle, even from the Riverside Press Enterprise. So a lot of those different articles are on my website. People can go and check through them, read through them, and see if anything interests them. Taking a lot of time to look back. I think I've got stuff from 66 through 69 on there, 3-4 years prior to the Zodiac crime. So I think it's a great idea. And I did find frequent authors who wrote steadily to the papers. Someone that would write a letter every week to an editor. So, I found a couple names, for example, that were frequent letter writers. They wrote every week to the Vallejo Times-Herald. But when I did a little bit of research, I found out one guy was an African-American man, so I knew he wasn't Zodiac. And the other guy was, I think he was 65 during the mid to late 1960s. So I knew he wasn't the guy. So these guys that turned out to be frequent letter writers, I was able to rule out once I determined who they were. But it was interesting just to see someone like that wrote letters like that I imagined Zodiac might do. Now, I and others have found interesting phrases and slogans in some letters, and unfortunately, as I recall, their names weren't published with them. They'd use a pseudonym like a citizen or concerned citizen or something like that have some interesting Zodiac-like verbiage in them. But again, there's nothing to go on because there's no name attached to them. They used a pseudonym.
And we also have to be careful because we don't know whether the Zodiac killer deliberately chose these words or inadvertently wrote these words in his letters, do we?
Yeah, and again, taking care to cover his tracks, maybe he would write things in letters to the editor, or letters that he sent police that he wouldn't use in his everyday life. So, you might see some writing from him in his everyday life, and things that he wrote about then might not line up with what he wrote about when he was writing Zodiac stuff. But I like the idea, and I love people that take the time to go through and look at stuff like that and see if they can find any clues there. It's worth looking for, and it may be a needle in the haystack, but you never know. You might find a name and something jumps out. You do some research, and all of a sudden you have an interesting suspect.
Have you searched the newspapers outside the Bay Area?
So I did do some limited searches. I looked down in the Santa Barbara area, thinking of the Domingos Edwards case. I did some searching down in some of those papers. As I mentioned, I looked at 66 era Riverside Press letters to the editor. So those were primarily the ones I searched for. And I did some more broader searches, just people using specific phrases around California in newspaper, letters to the editor in different newspapers. But I've never found anything that screams this person might be Zodiac. I never found a name attached to anything that I could come back and say, let me check this person out closer. Just nothing, no smoking guns, so to speak.
Do you think the Lake Herman Road murders were his first murders, or do you think he murdered before the Lake Herman Road crime, or had committed other type of offences?
I think they, as far as confirmed crimes, I think they were, I know some people like to say, well, Zodiac might not have killed him, he just took responsibility for them. I think they were 100% Zodiac murders. I would guess they were his first. I think we've talked a little bit about in Alameda County in 1967, there were a double murder of a Hispanic couple that had some very similar things to Zodiac. And I wondered if that could be Zodiac, but I don't want to go too far down that trail because I've spent a lot of years investigating Riverside and Santa Barbara, and those are just not confirmed Zodiac crimes. So I've spent so much years looking at that I talked to an investigator one day, and a retired investigator, and he said, listen, you could spend your time looking for things that you don't know if they're even connected to Zodiac, or you can focus your energy on things you know are Zodiac. And I took that advice, and that's what led me to this suspect that I have now, William Andrew, because I went down that road of, okay, let me look at people that, I'm not going to worry about whether they were in Riverside. I'm going to focus on things close to where we know for certain that Zodiac was, which is how I developed him. So, I thought it was good advice. Because at the end of the day, if you find the right person that was Zodiac and he's determined to be Zodiac, you can go back in and fill in the blanks and say, okay, were they ever in Riverside? Were they ever in Santa Barbara? And if they're 100% the Zodiac, but they were never in Riverside, never in Santa Barbara, then the people responsible for those crimes are just someone else.
There's a good reason why I brought up that question, and this concerns the areas associated with Zodiac, because a few years ago you unearthed some FBI files which Michael Cole published on his website. I scoured through them and noticed under Zodiac extortion of a robbery at a Wells Fargo bank in Sutter Street, San Francisco, where a demand note was passed over. It read, "This is bank robbery. If you do as I say, I will shot." It was presented in the bank on December the 3rd, 1968, 17 days before the Lake Herman Road murders, and was signed Zodiac. Most serial killers don't start with murder, so what significance do you place on this bank robbery demand note?
Well, that's something, that's...
Do you remember it?
I vaguely, it's bringing back memories, but, I don't remember, was there an image of it printed in there? Because that I don't remember seeing.
All I saw in the FBI files were they got suspects in and compared their handwriting to it. I don't know whether the image in the FBI file is the original or not. I believe it may be. Yeah. It is misspelt badly, just like the Zodiac misspelt things. I think he spelt robbery R-O-H-B-E-R-Y or something like that. Yeah. So it was deliberately or inadvertently misspelt, and the English wasn't particularly that good. So it was just the curiosity that maybe he called himself Zodiac and did lesser crimes before the Lake Herman Road murders. And the close proximity of it to the Lake Herman Road murders got me interested.
Well, and that's interesting. Anytime I see someone use the name Zodiac, before Zodiac, before the Zodiac used the name Zodiac, that's interesting because you have to wonder, is this person... did they use it in a different crime and they're using it in a murder that they just committed? Or maybe did he read about this crime in the bank note and say, oh, that sounds like a cool name. I'm going to use that when I start doing these killings here. So, we have to wonder, did Zodiac, use that name because he read about it in the paper, or did he have it on a watch? One we started recording, before we started recording today, you and I were talking a little bit about some cases we might want to do down the road. And this is a perfect segue, because talking the origins of Zodiac, for example, there's someone that's been referred to by the name Zod on some of the web forums, who was a Zodiac suspect, who's mentioned in Robert Graysmith's books. This is someone that used to walk around saying, "I'm the Zodiac." He used Zodiac as a nickname, and for some different reasons, people looking back, he graduated high school in the mid-60s, like 64, I want to say. And looking back, people said, what about this guy that used to call himself Zodiac back in 1964 down in San Bernardino? That's where he went to school. And all of a sudden, his name got bounced around and thrown on some forums. And it was interesting, because I started thinking, well, Zodiac is someone that he's influenced by stuff. What if he was a classmate of this guy Zod and just stole his name? He's not. What if this guy was, this guy Zod wasn't Zodiac? And I've spoken to him, and again, I think this would make an interesting future episode. But it's always possible that somehow, some way, Zodiac knew this kid and knew that he called himself Zodiac, and he says, I'm going to call myself Zodiac because I think that's a cool name. So I think anytime you're exploring why Zodiac called himself Zodiac and where he got that from, why he decided to start using it, and if he's connected to anything earlier than the murders using that name, I think that's a fascinating road to go down and sort of explore that stuff.
Because Zod himself didn't actually commit any crimes himself, did he?
Yeah, there's no evidence of that. I've talked to him extensively. I've looked at a lot of his handwriting. He has no ties at all to San Francisco. He's been there, I think, once in his life. Interesting, and again, I don't want to jump too much into him because I really think it'd be a fascinating episode about this guy and his whole backstory. But he's someone that if he lived in Vallejo, he would have been very high on the radar. And I don't want to give too many details away, because I'm just thinking in my head how some of the stuff I can share in this episode that we could do on him. But he was a fascinating character, sort of an Arthur Lee Allen type. And if he lived in Vallejo, he'd probably be a name that would be thrown out at the time of the Zodiac murders by a lot of people. But I don't think there's anything to him being Zodiac, but I wouldn't put it past Zodiac being someone that knew him perhaps and stole his name Zodiac for himself.
We have to distinguish the difference between people who call themselves Zodiac who didn't commit any crimes and people who actually committed a crime under the name of Zodiac. And this bank robbery crime, along with the Zodiac crimes, are the only two I know of.
Yeah, and I think what happened after the Zodiac was public knowledge, a lot of people, kooks and quacks and stuff, started coming forward and saying they were the Zodiac, or trying to scare friends and say they were, leave them notes, maybe just playing around. But, at the time, people were scared, so that they didn't take too kindly to someone saying they were Zodiac. But a lot of people try to, profit off of the name, try to get publicity under the name. And at the time, astrology and the study of Zodiac and the use of the word Zodiac was very popular in the mid to late 60s. It was a whole hippie time, and there was a lot of people that were just into that kind of stuff. So there were businesses named Zodiac, with Zodiac in the title of the business. And then, of course, you've got the watch with the Zodiac symbol on it, crosshair symbol. To me, I think that's most likely, if I had to guess, where Zodiac stole his, got that name from, because the fact it's got the name and the logo on the watch seems like it would be the most convenient place for him to come up with that. But who knows? But it's interesting to explore all the possible origins of where that name came from, why he started using it.
Yes, we have to remember that the person who signed the bank robbery note, if it was a Zodiac killer, then he certainly ditched the name Zodiac when he wrote his first communications to the newspapers, which sort of doesn't make any sense, really. Otherwise, he may as well have just continued with the name Zodiac, and he didn't. So the idea that in his first communications to the newspapers, he didn't use the name Zodiac, and then he used Zodiac on August the 4th, appears to suggest he found the name Zodiac somewhere in between July the 31st and August the 4th.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense that he would use the name as a criminal, then skip it, then use it again. And, I think you're right. I think something after his first letter made him say, I've got to have an evil villain name if I'm going to play this game. If I'm going to play this game with police, I've got to have some kind of sinister sounding villain name. So let me come up with something.
He clearly didn't like Cypher Slayer, did he?
I don't think so.
Now, if we jump forward and go back to the original police reports for our information, why do you think virtually no emphasis is placed on the statement of Sergeant William White, who said Brian Hartnell related to him that the subject advised him he was an ex-con out of Colorado? All the attention through the years has focused heavily on the Montana connection, which is different to the other statement. I was considering whether the killer brought a neighboring state to mind when he brought up Colorado.
Well, here's the thing. Obviously, there's been some discussion about that, and there's, I know over at Tom Voigt's site, ZodiacKiller.com, there's a recent discussion about the origins of that use of that phrase. And I think we look back at the reports. As a matter of fact, I was reading, someone pointed out that it was White, as I recall, that suggested to Hartnell. Hartnell was stumbling over the words, trying to think of what Zodiac said, and it was him that suggested Deer Lodge. So I think that's where the Deer Lodge came from. But here's the interesting thing: there was why I think it's Deer Lodge. Why I think he really said Deer Lodge is because there was a prison escape days before in Deer Lodge. There was no prison escape in Colorado. So I find it highly coincidental that Zodiac would say, I'm an escaped prisoner, from Deer Lodge, when there was an escape there just days before. Now, what's also interesting is that wasn't published. I and others looked around in California newspapers, and there were no mentions of that there. So how he would know that is beyond me. I think it's very possible that they had family there. My suspect, for example, he had a cousin that was dying in Deer Lodge at that time, and died very soon after the attack at Lake Berryessa. So to me, a conversation between my suspect and his parents might be something like, "Oh, your cousin in Deer Lodge isn't doing well. She's on her deathbed." And then what would he do? He'd bring up that name, and maybe they said, "Hey, there was a prison escape there, by the way." I could just see some kind of small talk to where he finds this information out and then uses it at his, at this attack. And it wouldn't mean anything to anyone. But if you go back and look at the clues, in my mind, it's just too big a coincidence that he mentions an escape prison, being an escape prisoner. It's possibly the word Deer Lodge, and there was just an escape at Deer Lodge. There wasn't one in Colorado. So to me, it's too much of a coincidence. I think he said Deer Lodge, and how he knew about it, that's another story. That's anyone's guess. But it wasn't published in newspapers that we could find in California. So I don't know how he would have known about it.
Yes, my contention at the time, because we last spoke about this, was that Sergeant John Robertson had sort of placed this in Brian Hartnell's mind while he was under heavy sedation at the hospital. And I know you had a different opinion last time on that, didn't you? So,
yeah, it's just one of those things that is, it seems like an important clue, but, again, 50 years ago, Brian under sedation, trying to remember words, him making suggestions to him, it leaves a big gray area as far as what's exactly true. But for me, I go back to there was a prison escape in Deer Lodge days before, and I find that too much of a coincidence for it not to be Deer Lodge.
Do you think, therefore, that Colorado was never spoken, and that was suggested by William White, or do you think Brian Hartnell did actually bring up the state of Colorado?
To me, I don't know. It's just too, again, he was hospitalized in pain under sedation. I think that's just a whole, one of them, it's like a bad night out drinking or partying, and the next day you're trying to remember what happened because it's a blur. If anyone's ever had one of those experiences, I think it was probably sort of like that, and we'll never really know, so it's one of them things where it might be a very important clue, if it's Deer Lodge and it is not Colorado, that's important, but I don't think we'll ever know for sure.
The reason I'll bring this up is because of the neighboring state of Oklahoma. On December the 7th, 1969, somebody mailed a letter with a cipher mocking the Jim Dunbar TV show by stating, "I just need help." A few hours later that day, somebody rang an Oklahoma radio station doing an awfully good impression of Sam, who called into the Jim Dunbar TV show. Therefore, we have two types of communication on the same day claiming to be the Zodiac killer, both referring to the Jim Dunbar TV show in some respect. The caller to the Oklahoma radio station wasn't reported in the newspapers as pleading for help, and the December the 7th letter stating "I just need help" wasn't published in the newspapers. Yet 13 days later, the Melvin Belli letter thrice stated, "Please help me." The close proximity of these letters and call has to be somehow significant. What are your thoughts on this one?
Well, it's definitely interesting, the timing, the use of the same phrases. I think where a lot of people just dismiss something automatically, like why would the Zodiac call a news station in Oklahoma, and why, if they're going to do something related to Zodiac, why not do it in San Francisco or Vallejo? Who knows why Zodiac did what he did? Did he know someone there? Did he have some family connection there? It's hard to say, but I wouldn't rule anything out. I know you've spent time trying to get a hold of this recording, just to see what it sounds like, if it exists still. But the use of the words, the phrasing, that kind of stuff, on top of letters that are connected to the Zodiac case, when something like that happens, it's hard to just dismiss and say they're not connected. If Zodiac used the same exact words that were in phone calls and other things, then you have to look at that, in my opinion, and see if there's any kind of connection there.
And the mechanics of the code itself on December the 7th seemed to show knowledge of the 340 cipher, because he highlights the word death by splitting up that Zodiac on the bottom line of the 340. There's an apparent looking Zodiac thing at the bottom. You've noticed that. The person who wrote the December the 7th letter split that up, which you'd expect a hoaxer to just copy. He split that up and used the last two symbols from the 340. And when you look at those last five symbols on the December the 7th letter, they actually spell the word death, just like the 340. And obviously it wasn't solved back then. This seems to show intrinsic knowledge of the mechanics of the 340 cipher, which is even more compelling to me than this coincidence with the phone call to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
But you made a good point, and the only reason I mentioned this is, what is the likelihood that somebody wanting to mimic the Zodiac killer would think, "Oh, well, I'll call an Oklahoma radio station." No, you'd expect him to call a San Francisco radio station or send a letter within San Francisco or the Bay Area, not call somewhere all the way out in Oklahoma to pretend he was a Zodiac killer. This seems to make no sense to me.
Yeah, I agree too. It's sort of like, the Albany, New York letters we've discussed. If you're a copycat, why be operating all the way out there? You would think you want attention, you're going to do it in the Bay Area. So again, there's any number of possibilities. It's just not Zodiac and it's some hoaxer who's trying to capitalize off the Zodiac name or the attention the case got, or it's really him and he's calling there for some reason. Maybe it's too much heat on him in San Francisco and he doesn't want his, they're going to be looking for calls that might be him, and maybe he's doing it out to someplace far away, or maybe Maybe he read an article about the station and he didn't like the station for some reason and he decided to target them with a phone call. Who knows? Again, he could have family out there. Any number of reasons that the real Zodiac could have made a call to some place outside of the Bay Area and chose to do that.
And if he was making a story up on the fly at Lake Berryessa, he's hardly going to say, I'm an ex-con out of Oklahoma. So my thinking was that he thought of a neighboring state immediately out of his brain, like Colorado, and just brought that up into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's any number of possibilities. And I think, again, this is an unsolved case. It's, over 50 years old. I think thinking outside the box is a good thing. Thinking of different things. Is there merit? Is there any kind of connection? Is there anything at all that could be from the real Zodiac might provide more clues than we found over the first 50 years? Maybe someone needs to explore some different avenues. And so I always, I think people should always be searching and digging and thinking outside the box and looking at other stuff that has been dismissed in the past.
Just as a matter of interest, do you believe that the Oakland PD call before Sam appeared on the Jim Dunbar show, this was the Zodiac killer?
I don't know. Apparently the voice was different, supposedly, and there's not a lot of detail about it, if it was the same number, if they were able to determine that. Obviously, they didn't think it was Eric Wheel, but I don't know that there's anything to indicate who it could have been, if there's anything that could ever identify them. I just don't know. Personally, I would guess if you're a killer, serial killer, you're not going to want to leave your voice on a TV show that a lot of people are going to see and listen to. Again, I'm thinking what I would do, but these are serial killers. They don't think like I do. So maybe they weren't thinking about that. But the last thing I'd want to do is have my voice out there so my coworker or my friend or a relative could recognize my voice and come forward. So he might not know if he's being recorded if he called there. So I wouldn't take the chance of calling into the show, but maybe he did. He was, sometimes he didn't think about stuff. He was impulsive. So it's possible he could have called in the show. But I personally would have been worried that somehow if I call in someplace, my voice is going to be recorded. But then again, this is the same person that wrote dozens of, letters that are all over the internet. And in my opinion, it's his real handwriting, and he wasn't worried about anyone spotting that. So maybe he didn't care that anyone would even hear his voice.
This is, after all, the Zodiac killer, in other words.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, just to wrap this up on the Oklahoma thing, there's another reason I brought that question up to you, is that one more thing likely connects the Jim Dunbar TV show with the Oklahoma radio call. On October the 21st, 1969, just hours before the Jim Dunbar TV show and the call to the Oakland Police Department, somebody rang the Palo Alto Times and threatened a school bus, but stated he had left San Francisco because I'm too hot there. The Oklahoma radio caller on December the 7th said to the host he left California because it got too hot for me. I would suggest that these are the same two people, and one was just before the Jim Dunbar show, and this was a call to Oklahoma mentioning the Jim Dunbar show on the same day a letter arrived mimicking the Jim Dunbar show caller saying, I need help. Three strange coincidences tying all these things together.
Yeah, and it's for those reasons that I think it shouldn't be just discounted or overlooked. I think time should be spent to determine, could these be the real Zodiac? Now, is this one hoaxer that's just calling saying it's too hot in San Francisco and I'm leaving, and then they're also calling Oklahoma for whatever reason? If it's one person and they're the Zodiac, that obviously that's important. If it's one person doing all this, but they're not the Zodiac, then it's just a big hoax and a big rabbit hole to go down. But I think, a lot of people have dismissed some of this stuff. I think time should be spent considering it. And because it could be a clue, if it's really from the real Zodiac, there might be some clues here to work with that we haven't had for 50 years. Again, one of the things you mentioned was maybe trying to somehow see if this recording exists. because it could be Zodiac's real voice or someone could recognize it. So, I think digging into the stuff is worthwhile.
Now, moving on, I'll ask you a couple of quick-fire questions. How many murderers would you say write to the newspapers, like the Zodiac Killer?
Not very many. There was Son of Sam. There were a few back in the 30s and 40s, but not many. It's not commonplace, because most criminals don't want to be caught. They want to avoid detection. Some people seek out that attention. The two most, Jack the Ripper did it even. But the two ones that really parallel each other the most, as do their crimes, are Son of Sam and Zodiac. Because, a lot of David Berkowitz was a loner. He wasn't successful with women. He was a underachiever. He struck on lovers' lanes, random shootings, no connections to the victims. He enjoyed the press talking about him. He made it a cat and mouse game. He wrote letters. It is very similar to Zodiac, and those are two cases that nothing jumps to mind that are quite like those cases. So I think those two really, really mirror each other. And I don't know if Berkowitz was familiar with the Zodiac case and said, I'm going to do what he did, or they just were two peas of the same pod, that they just were the same kind of person and wanted that attention. But they're definitely very similar. But that's not a common thing. Most killers do not want to reach out to police. I got into a little bit of a debate with somebody on a forum the other day that Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, was also the Zodiac Killer, which is just complete nonsense. But even if you look at Zodiac, he was an attention seeker. He loved the attention. The Golden State Killer didn't write letters to the police. He didn't contact the police. He didn't contact the press. He didn't want attention. He was content to torture people, and cause pain and suffering on them. And that was his thing. He didn't need the attention. He didn't need to read about himself in the newspaper. So I think you can look at different people that commit these kinds of crimes any place in the world, for that matter, but across the United States at least, and sort of see that it's rare when killers go out of their way to communicate with police like that.
So following that up, how many murderers do you think wrote to the newspapers and included a cipher?
I know of a few ciphers that were mailed. I don't know that any of them were murders, but I have a feeling you're going to know the answer. You're going to tell me the answer.
No, actually, I know that Ted Kaczynski wrote some number sort of ciphers, didn't he, that they found in his shack.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether he actually mailed them.
Well, and that's the thing. I'm not a Ted Kaczynski expert by any stretch. I know there's plenty of people out there that will know the answer to this. So my understanding, and I'm sure people will correct me if I'm wrong, is that some of this stuff was coded for himself
That's right.
For him to know what he was doing and talking about and remind himself, as opposed to sending a cipher to the newspaper and saying, you can't catch me, here's this cipher, and if you crack it, you'll have me. This was something different. The Zodiac's was, I'm going to get attention with this. This was a way for him to wave a big red flag and say, look at me. I'm this arch villain sending letters taunting the police and outsmarting them. So that is a different kind of bird than Ted Kaczynski leaving coded ciphers for himself to give himself clues and reminders about things that he was doing.
That wasn't a question to trip you up in any way. It's just that I think you agree with me that people who write to the newspapers who've killed people or send ciphers with their letters are a very rare specimen. But I know people will disagree with this next part, and I don't know what your thoughts are, but I know people will question the validity of the 148 character cipher and letter mailed around May of 1971. But in the next podcasts, I will go a long way to comprehensively verifying that cipher. So just for the sake now, Mike, imagine that letter is genuine and that cipher is genuine. What is the likelihood that his 148 character cipher used a similar style of symbols to the 1973 Albany letter And both ciphers would use the ciphertext symbol number 7 to represent the letter A both times, despite neither being published in the newspapers. This being the case, doesn't it suggest the same author and strengthen the links of Zodiac to New York?
Well, that's the interesting thing is, so it's easy for a Zodiac copycat to, read something in the paper, if it's the text of a letter or the text of a cipher, and repeat that. It's not easy for him, if there's no image to go by, to make a copycat letter and use the same symbols, same kind of style. And I think a lot of people overlook that. They just say, oh, it was in the newspaper, so he knew about it. Well, it doesn't matter if he didn't see an image of it. How could he duplicate it? So I think anytime you have something like that going on where there's the same type of images, same type of symbols used, if they weren't published in any kind of paper for a copycat to see, you have to spend some time there and consider, could this be valid? Because, it's different to produce a text or an image or writing that looks like Zodiac's if you've actually seen it, if you've seen a copy of it. But if it was never produced in a newspaper, magazine, what have you, then there's no way you could duplicate that. And I think that would be too much of a coincidence. So at that point, you have to spend some time there and say, is there something to this?
I know there are lots of people out there who probably disagree with me that the 148 character cipher and letter are genuine. And also a lot of people don't believe the Albany letter is genuine. My point being was they had to be the same author, because not only did both send a cipher into the newspapers, they both used the same ciphertext symbol to represent the same letter in plain text, which would be absolutely highly unlikely to have happened accidentally by two different authors.
Yeah. So somehow, some way, it would be two authors not only using the same style, but choosing the same symbol to represent the same character. And
so even if you don't believe it's Zodiac, you have to believe it's the same author because of the rarity of people sending not only letters to people in the media, but also sending ciphers.
Yeah, and then what was the 148 character cipher again?
What you mean? What was in the content of it?
Yeah.
Well, it's my contention that it came in a few days after Carl Francis Werner was arrested for the murders of Snoozy and Furlong, and he said, "Stop listening to phonies." The phonies he's referring to, Eric Wheel and Carl Francis Werner. Of course, Zodiac was the phony. But he was clinging on to the murders he'd claimed back in November when he put August in the November the 8th dripping pen card. That's what we'll cover a little bit more in the next episode, along with the 340 itself and Dave Aranchak's find. But he was reluctant to relinquish the murders he'd added to his total in the dripping pen card. And the calling out of phonies, we'll go into this a little bit more detail. I don't want to give too much away. But the notion is he's calling out Carl Francis Werner as a phony because he's stolen two of his victims off him effectively. He never thought that crime would ever get finalized. So that's why he wrote that letter and then followed it up with a Monticello card claiming Kathy Biek.
Yeah. And where was the 148 cipher mailed from?
Fairfield.
Okay. So
which latches back into the Fairfield.
Yeah. So now you have someone in Fairfield, which is right next to Vallejo, and then you have Albany, New York, and then you have the same choices of style and the same symbol used. And we already have talked about the connection to Albany, New York of, victims of Zodiac, or at least one and her husband and even suspect Richard Gaikowski. So to me, in my mind, you can't simply just write it off and say, okay, it's just a hoax, forget about it. Because when you have that, you've already got an Albany connection there to New York, and you've got the same writing style, the same thing. Now, is it Zodiac, or is it somebody traveling back and forth from California to Albany and just happens to be a copycat and they're writing letters in both places? That's a possibility too. But I do think you're right that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for someone to use the same cipher style, same symbols, and even use the same symbol to represent one of the same letters, unless it was the same person or they had seen images and could duplicate it.
But think about how many letters were mailed from Fairfield. How many can you recall?
I thought it was 2.
Well, there's 2 in December, isn't there?
Yeah.
And this one. And all 3 contain ciphers. So every letter from Fairfield that was mailed contained a cipher.
Yeah. And those, again, they're widely flat out dismissed by a lot of people as just being a hoax. But I think there's questions there still that you just have to, you have to say, is there anything to this? Now, again, if I wanted to hoax a Zodiac letter, again, I'm thinking what I would do. I would try and make it look just like all the other Zodiac letters. These look so different from Zodiac that I would think like the police would get it and say, oh, this doesn't look anything like this. This isn't Zodiac. So if you want to hoax a letter and you want someone to think you're the real Zodiac, why not make it look like Zodiac?
Exactly.
And these look so different that it makes me wonder the opposite. Could this actually be Zodiac? And he's...
he didn't care because he was the Zodiac.
Yeah, he's changing his style a little bit. So where some people write it off, I don't write anything off. I'll say that they don't look like the Zodiac's, typical letters or writing, but I'm not going to just blindly dismiss them as being complete forgeries.
I don't believe it for a minute, but you could easily just as well say the 340 letter is a hoax, because the only thing going for it is the writing that we've got on the dripping pen card and a cipher that anybody could have copied. So, we could lay this hoax argument to every letter virtually, unless it included a shirt piece.
Yeah, and that's just it. There's short of something with physical evidence, and we've all seen how this handwriting thing has gone. Handwriting alone now is just not something that we can rely on, and police won't rely on. They'll never solve this case because somebody has handwriting that looks or doesn't look like Zodiac. That's not going to happen. It's all about physical evidence. They want fingerprints, they want DNA, and that's it. So again, what we don't know, because police are tight-lipped about, is how many Zodiac correspondences share some of the same partial or latent fingerprints or palm prints. We don't have access to all that. If, or the phone calls, if you got any partial prints off a phone booth, that kind of thing. How many of these things match each other? Because if you've got enough partials and latent prints and some of them match each other, then it's one person doing all this. And the police have these answers and probably know the answer. They're just not being public with it. But that's one thing to consider. And then you could sort of say at the end of the day, all right, this has a print, this one has a print, and they all match in some way. So you could sort of tie them all together as being all legit.
Well, let's move over to Atlanta. And this is something you've noticed yourself and posted on the forum in the past, that the Albany letter envelope and the Atlanta letter envelope both contained extremely small crosshairs on the address side of the envelope, just like the unpublished Paul Stein letter. Do you think this is a coincidence, bearing in mind the Atlanta letter spoke of picking off kids and mentioned that he used to be in San Francisco, harking back to the Paul Stein murder and the letter that arrived on October the 13th, in other words, with a small crosshair on the address side? In other words, a letter arrived in Atlanta in 1981, harking back to the Paul Stein letter, and both contain small crosshairs on the address side of the envelope. Is this really a coincidence?
I mean, it could be a coincidence. The Atlanta letter is another example of a letter that doesn't look much like a real Zodiac letter. So if you're a hoaxer, you would want to duplicate what a real Zodiac letter looks like, and that one looks so different that I just don't see why they would try and hoax it, spend their time hoaxing a letter and make it look nothing like a real Zodiac letter. Now, they did say I've in that Atlanta letter, I changed my handwriting for whatever reason. But one possibility, and again, this could all be one big hoaxer. Where these letters are being mailed from is one big hub, one big set of hubs, major hubs, where they could be traveling for work or something. And when they travel, they're mailing letters from there, Albany, Atlanta, the Bay Area. major travel corridors. So maybe they are moving around for work, flying places, and they'll mail a letter when they arrive in those different destinations for work. And so you could have theoretically one hoaxer, or Zodiac, if it's really from Zodiac and he's traveling for work, you could have, that way the same person is mailing these letters from different parts of the country, and they're doing it while they're traveling for work. That's a possibility.
Because there were 3 letters from Atlanta, one on March the 2nd, the stop force busing letter, then the one on March the 8th that we just spoke about, and then there was one on March the 18th, imploring Daniel to please call home.
Yeah, it's almost like you have this little burst of activity during that time. Now, is this someone that's living there for an extended period of time, or is this someone that has business meetings they're going to be attending for a week or something? You know what I mean? So it could be someone that's there temporarily, and they're doing this while they're there, and then they're leaving, going back home, or they're residing in that area for whatever period of time. I think it's very possible that it's one person doing all of these letters, and then the question just becomes, is that one person a hoaxer or the real Zodiac?
And what we know of the Zodiac killer from the Bay Area is that at least twice he rang the police and directed them to the scene of the crime. Now, in Atlanta, somebody rang the Conyers Sheriff's Office and directed the police to the scene of a crime, claiming there were bodies there. This was a white Caucasian male. And this recording has also been placed on tape. So whether that still exists along with the Oklahoma recording, I don't know. But this could very well be Zodiac as well. It may not be, but it doesn't hurt to try and find out.
Yeah, I mean, any time that you can hear a voice and put it out there and see if it can be identified, it's worthwhile. But
especially if both are the same.
Yeah, well, that'd be really interesting if you have 2 different callers in 2 different locations that sound identical. Then that would lead you to believe that they're one dedicated hoaxer, or maybe the real Zodiac, whatever you determination can be made. But it's worth trying to dig into the challenges in getting a hold of these old materials is finding that recording if it exists and getting your hands on it.
That's why I would implore any listeners to try and contact these people, because I've tried and failed, and there's no point in beating a dead horse. So I was hoping somebody with a bit more clout may be able to get these people to respond to them.
Well, that's just it. When anytime you do a podcast, we're reaching listeners all over the country, the United States, all around the world. I'm sure we have listeners, but someone out there listening may have connections or pull or ideas on how to get a hold of these things. And they're interesting things to consider. It doesn't mean, that they're all connected to the real Zodiac, but even if they can be ruled out as being connected to the Zodiac, we can sort of thin things out a little bit and make the case a little bit easier to manage as far as what's real and what's not. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Seriously Mysterious. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
My name is John Lorden, and I've been looking into hundreds of unsolved mysteries over the past 5 years on my YouTube channel, Lorden Arts. And I've been known to bring a respectful, victim-focused approach to the stories that I cover while donating thousands of dollars directly to those cases and the charities that help them. Now, I'm bringing that approach and sensibility, along with some of the biggest mysteries I've ever looked into and some new ones, to a weekly podcast called Seriously Mysterious. From bizarre occurrences to unsolved murders and unexplainable disappearances, everything is fair game on this show as long as it's seriously mysterious. You can find Seriously Mysterious on your favorite podcatchers or by visiting seriouslymysterious.com. Let's look into the mysterious together.